King of Podcasts Radio Network proudly presents the Broadcasters Podcast, a weekly media commentary talking about traditional and digital media headlines and talking to the content creators out front and behind the scenes. Here is the King of Podcasts.
Here we go, another Broadcasters Podcast. This week we're going to go ahead and do a deep dive into podcasting as we start the program. We're also going to go ahead and look into a casualty in the corporate end for Disney Plus and their original plan to be able to go ahead and go after the digital disruption by providing a slew of content, and in the hopes that their content was going to go ahead and position themselves very well and would get them to a place where they were hoping that they were going to go ahead and get Disney Plus off the ground and help make up ground in the digital disruption, of which Netflix or Apple Plus and other places are well ahead of the pack of the digital disruption, well ahead of being ready for the future of digital media. Meanwhile, Disney, because of the pandemic and other various factors, are maneuvering around managerial changes, doing a lot of things to try to help build back up what they're trying to do, because they are panicking. Much like the other big corporate media giants, they are panicking to try to get themselves to a certain spot. And that's where they're all coming from right now. But Disney Plus just put out some information about their second quarter financials, and there's some news to be said about that. We're going to talk about that here on the program and discuss it. Now, let's go ahead and look at what's going on first with podcasting, because this is important. So before we do anything, let's look at the whole construct of podcasting right now and why is it in such an important media sector to go ahead and look at, and why so many people are going into it. Now, we focus on social audio, which I had a chance to go ahead and listen to some of the programming that's on Clubhouse so far. And personally, I haven't gotten anything that makes me feel like it's that big of a change around. Like, it's there and it's interesting, but I don't feel like there's much there to me that stands out too much. It's not radio, and I don't think radio needs to be concerned with it too much, because what we're getting from Clubhouse, and I said this on my When I'm Not Podcasting series, but briefly I'll reiterate it here, is I feel like that content is basically what we would see at a conference. Like, you go to at a conference or a networking function and there's a couple of people speaking on a panel. That is what Clubhouse is really meant to be. That is what I'm seeing the most of, people doing anything on there. When it comes to that, when it comes to Twitter or Facebook, and I think the adoption has been better by the business sector than it is for everyday people. Now, there are some things to be taken from there, entrepreneurial things on cryptocurrency, things on the media industry that I've actually found quite fascinating, which is good. But there's still a lot of adoption necessary, and there are a lot of people that I feel are being intimidated by doing audio. Now, I, of course, could do a show like that, do a show over there on Clubhouse, but you do require to have quite a bit of an entourage to put together to host the program, because people that want to do Clubhouse, they don't want to go ahead and sit there talking by themselves, and they're a little bit nervous of being able to do that. So you might have one person that is willing to moderate, but then you need to have the ensemble cast that will do also talking on the Clubhouse call, because you're on there committing about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. You know, there's a lot of people that do all day Clubhouse calls, and they're on there, and they have the people that follow all these people, and they basically have the peanut gallery that's also following along, which is good. But that isn't podcasting. And with podcasting, which I think I know a little bit about, my background is I started doing podcasting August 1st, 2005. We call it audio archiving. We were having people connecting on phones through a phone hybrid, and we would record the calls, and we would produce around it as a radio show. Now, we do understand that the podcasting model's changed a lot. We can appreciate what the NPR folks have done to give us a style that works, and we can also appreciate a number of shows that preceded in this evolution of podcasting that kind of gave us the form of how to do podcasts, so that you can get an idea of what shows are on top that really do best right now. So at the moment, when you look at the whole gamut of podcasting right now, it is run partly like a SiriusXM model, where the biggest names and the biggest profiles are the ones that get advertising revenue. At the very beginning, I mean, going back, 12, 13 years ago, after Adam Carolla left Free FM, and he left the whole FM talk format because him and David Lee Roth were essentially the scapegoats for the exiting Howard Stern. Because what they did was, CBS Radio, they decided, well, with Howard Stern leaving, to occupy the spots that Howard left, they decided to put on two hosts in different markets to see what they would do. Well, David Lee Roth came on. David Lee Roth was a very eccentric, interesting show, but it wasn't great. He was interesting, and he was an interesting train wreck for a while. And they did a whole lot of changes to it to try to make it work. But again, they tried something because they thought, well, maybe we can get somebody else there, hold on to that audience. Even if we can't hold on to the entire audience, let's try to do something. And so it didn't work. And Adam Carolla somewhat held on to his audience because of how it was positioned for him. And so they tried, and he did okay. But he was only there for a certain contract period, and the kind of money he was probably making on that wasn't going to be the same. He might have been asking for a cut. And I think it might have been that the actual format was actually being changed, which is what prompted him to go to podcasting. And he's the first one to truly get the real audience for podcasting, really brought podcasting to the mainstream, was Adam Carolla. And since then, he's still doing his show. But it's not, there's just some people that will be the trendsetters, start off, but will not be able to keep that spot all the time. Even Joe Rogan has had a good spot for a number of years, but even he has dropped off a bit. And there's maybe just a little bit of a fatigue of listening to his show and the kind of show he does. And I think it's always with Joe Rogan, it's based on the guests. And which some shows, it's based on the guests that you bring on. Now, for myself, I've done the Broadcasters Podcast now here 2.5 years. And I've had a number of guests on the show. And they do good. I don't think there's much of a difference between me hosting the program and having a guest interview segment afterwards. For the last, actually since the start of the year, I stopped putting out any more interviews, basically because I didn't have any more to put out. I went ahead and, during the pandemic, I took and got a large slew of guests, and I booked them all, and I ran them in 2 or 3 parts, which worked well, and it took me all the way into this year. And then I stopped because at the moment I want to bring on guests based on topics, but then I don't, it's not a problem prepping for guests. It's not a problem doing the interview format, but it's not the only thing I want to do on this program. It's because there's also a thing where now that we've had this digital disruption, we've had all these different subjects to talk about. I wanted to make sure to go and take the full 60 minutes and talk about what I wanted to talk about of the various number of issues. Difference is, last week, if I had a guest interview, it probably would have been good because I only had about a half hour worth of content. And even then, I only got to about 26, 27 minutes. But with podcasting, I only want to talk about what I think will fit the format, guarantee people a certain amount of time of programming, and make sure they get that every week. And if they want to have it every day or every other day, then it needs to be a certain way. Because we know that in podcasting, there are a number of people listening to different shows at the same time. Some people might listen to the same show and be willing to go ahead and have a 3-4 hour show that long with a guest. And they'll just come back to it until they finish it. Or they don't have to listen to the whole thing. Or you have a show that is within a 30 to 60 minute format, maybe a 2-hour format, but then you make sure that you fill that time. And if you're a good podcaster, you're going to fill that time efficiently. and you want to make sure you're not putting in fluff. I would also think a good podcaster should also be able to stay in their lane. If you're putting on a show, it's kind of like how the TikTok algorithm is working, where the TikTok algorithm works best for creators when people stick to a certain topic and they're known for that particular topic. But so that's why you do different channels for different shows. That's what I think works well here. So for me, I'm not doing one King of Podcast program, because when I first decided to do the show, I was thinking I didn't want to just do one particular show and talk about everything, because that's just going to broaden the audience, and I'm not that much of a compelling figure. And I understand that. I have a reasonable ego. But what I do know is that I want shows that are compartmentalized, that are meant to be for a particular subject. So media is this program. I have a pro wrestling program. I don't talk about pro wrestling on this program or other programs necessarily, because it stays in its lane. Wrestling for wrestling fans, that's where it goes. Then I have my When I'm Not Podcasting series, which is different, because what I do there is I basically took the YouTube creator type of format, where there are a number of people that might have, they used to be like the political style of it. But for me, there's probably about a good 5 or 6 subjects that I like to talk about that are outside of the normal gamut of all the programming that I do. And that's not even counting, I do hosting a program called Blunt Business over on CannabisRadio.com, one of the full-time networks that I manage. But that program is just interview-based specifically, and I really don't take much time to talk about certain issues and rant. But on When I'm Not Podcasting, I do. But there's basically about 5 or 6 subjects on that program, of which I will do 5 to 15-minute segments every other day. So basically, people are getting about 4 days a week of content, which leads to about an hour's worth, or half hour to an hour's worth of content. But I'm only focusing on what the content is. If there's something relatable and I have 2 subjects or 2 stories to bring up, I will bring it up in the same segment. Usually cannabis is one good subject. I talk about dating all the time. I talk about working in rideshare, because I do Uber and Lyft. And there's other subjects to look at when it comes to pop culture and music, which doesn't necessarily fit the broadcaster's podcast model, because we're talking about something different. Because I might talk about things that are going on in entertainment and showbiz, but it doesn't necessarily relate to the program, because I'm not talking about gossip. So that show, I might bring up gossip on that show, or other pop culture trends that also fit in the space. Basically, that's like the circle that I do, and I rotate those subjects quite a bit. And sometimes I will talk about podcasting, a little bit here and there. We'll talk about that as well. But that's the way I've learned how to do podcasting. And for others out there, there are those that are doing shows, there might be celebrities, which will be just, it's celebrity driven. It's really nothing that has to do with what the celebrity is going to say. When it's NPR, there is a particular subject. Or NPR will do their programming like they do radio and repurpose it. But then that show, their shows will be different topics all the time. And you just have to realize, well, is this something I'm going to be interested in? Or am I going to listen to it because of the host and because the show is the show? So you market yourself as the personality, or you market yourself for the content. I prefer to be content driven. Content is king. The control of your content is in your hands. I say it on every show. It's true. And so for me, when I look at podcasting and who listens to it, and how you can monetize off of it, you have to realize those parameters. The other thing, too, is that you want to have a library of different programming to listen to. I don't know about you, but I find it really hard to listen to podcasts. Not listen to them per se, but find shows to listen to. Because there's a lot of the same stuff out there. And that's because there were particular radio formats that did serve in the radio space that are no longer in the radio space, the terrestrial radio space, the man talk type of programming. So your Donna Mikes, your Tom Likas, your Bob and Toms, all the morning show format type shows. You have a lot of those now embedded into podcasting as well. And there's a lot of celebrity driven shows, because in those celebrity driven shows, the podcast format, when the celebrity is accompanied by producers or handlers or some kind of a host that can help to move the show along, keep things under context, make it somewhat interesting. But then some of the people that are brought on to do those shows with the celebrities, for me, I just feel like they're not so much facilitators. They don't play their role. They want to be a host. They want to be at the level of the celebrity. So they are basically piggybacking off the celebrity. And I don't like those shows either. Plus, some celebrity shows I'm not interested in because they don't have any attachment to society. Maybe when they first started, but there's probably a lot of things they might talk about that I will not relate to. Personally, I'll prefer to go ahead and listen to somebody's podcast when I'm checking out clips on TikTok or maybe Instagram. Somebody will put them up as part of some story that's going on. And then sometimes I won't hear anything about a show that might be doing well, but then there'll be some reason we'll hear about it. But we talked about it pretty extensively about podcasting here on the program. And the thing is, with podcasting going to celebrities, were they able to get a big payday and be able to do this content because they needed it for the pandemic? Well, now some of them are deciding to do the same thing here. And some of them have tried to dabble into Clubhouse and other features because there are some that are trying to go ahead and have a social footprint. But we know that for a number of celebrities, it's really something that's being driven by their management, by their publicity, trying to find another way to continue to stay connected and attached to your fan base. Because then you have to make sure your fan base is interested in what you're doing that is not any way similar to what you do in movies, in music, stand-up, whatever it might be. And we know there are some comedy podcasts out there. There's many of them. I mean, there's a lot. If you want to look for it, go for it. But I don't go for those either. Because I think it's kind of tough to go ahead and continue to give a good set of funny content to keep people laughing throughout a comedy podcast has to be tough. Especially for some of the shows that you have to do and the kind of prep that you have to do. So for me, when I listened to some of the shows, when I gave it a little bit of chance to comedy podcasts, my thing is, remember, these are stand-up comedians that have a set that's maybe like 15, 20, maybe 30 minutes long. Or they have a 60-minute show. That's a special on HBO. So to do that, it's different. Plus, if there's the availability of some of those hosts or some of those guests, there's a lot to be said about trying to do the large-scale, high-profile type programming, which is also above and beyond promoted over anything else as grassroots or people that are fans of content or whatever there might be. That's a bigger difference. So it's a lot to take in. And there is so much out there. It's hard to keep track with what to go ahead and listen to, where to find it, and then if you're also trying to market and advertise, who to go to. But the model that has worked best for advertisers is to go through ad rep firms and to go ahead and put out large-scale advertising, push it across not so much the individual podcasters. There's only certain ones that will get particular sponsors. They're these direct-to-market type advertisers. Other than that, anything that's large-scale, that would be normal radio advertising that would go out to all the major radio networks, well, they're just getting serviced by the podcast outlets that are just inserting dynamically the ads, just like on this show. Like I have big name advertising on this show because the dynamic ad insertion. Partly because the deal is made for me to go ahead and work with Spreaker and go through their pilot program. But by doing that, this show gets monetized. And it's the only way I monetize. I try to do Amazon for a couple of years, and it's hit or miss. And I could do other affiliate programs, and that's also hit or miss. It's just, this is the easier way to go ahead and monetize. Now, I'm not going to break the bank here, but that's not my point of doing the show. I enjoy talking about all these topics that I do on a regular basis. I enjoy prepping. I enjoy doing the interviews. I enjoy doing the research because it's the research I already do in the first place. when you have a passion for podcasting and you have a passion for doing this and you're really interested in it, and you can tell people really have the time, the programming that will interest me the most are for those that are really embedded and have a real understanding of what they're talking about. And they know how to present it. So my thing is, I want podcasters that are as good as the best DJs out there, the best radio hosts that are quick with wit or good understanding and knowledge. I want people that are very well researched, that really take the time to just not give us, hey, how are you doing? Or tell us about yourself. I can't handle interviews like that. Even on Cannabis Radio or WMR.FM, the sister network that I also run with, I can't stand interviews that start that way. So I can't, even the hosts that I have on there that are doing shows, I try to have them avoid having the, how are you? How did you get your start? I can't stand that crap. If you've listened to some of the interviews I've done with some top, some decent profiled names in the cannabis industry that I've done on Blunt Business as of late, I talked to Tommy Chong. I didn't talk about his career and all the stuff he did with Cheech and Chong and that 70s show and all that. No, I had certain subjects I wanted to talk with him about, and the show did well because I respected him to go ahead and talk about things that were important, that I thought he had an important voice to give. With Dr. Dina, the same thing. Dr. Dina is the one that is the inspiration for the Nancy Botwin character on Showtime's Weeds. Also, was given the name Dr. Dina by Snoop Dogg, so she was really Snoop Dogg's exclusive dealer. So that's how, if you don't know who she is, if you don't know, now you know. But that's podcasting to me. That's really the essence of it. The best podcasters are ones that really know their subject, that really know their space. I spent over 25 years in this space. Now, I might not be the biggest expert in this space, but I have a lot of knowledge because I've read a lot. I have followed the space in a lot of different ways. And so some of my opinion, my analysis goes a certain way. The one thing I'm understanding, which is also needs to be important, is that some podcasters want to go ahead and do something to get the biggest amount of fandom, the biggest amount of audience. Not me. When I do my wrestling program, I don't worry about, creating programming that is going to just be in lockstep with every other podcaster out there. No, I go on a different lane. The way I want to talk about it. The way I know how things are. This program is not made for everybody. This media program is specific. But this is a subject that I don't know anybody else talking about. That's why I felt like I needed to fill a void. So I'm the one that did it. I didn't feel like All Things Media, Bob Garfield, to his credit, he does a good job. But some of his content doesn't hit it for me. I listened to it, but it didn't stay consistent for me. Sometimes it's different. And I'll admit, some of the NPR programming is political. And when they start adding politics to their content, I'm not interested. So this program doesn't get politics. We stay away from political. And even more so this year because I swore off news and politics. So that's not even part of my vernacular anymore. It's not even part of anything. So podcasting itself as a whole. Let me go to Forbes as my first article to go ahead and bring up here. And the Edison Research's Infinite Dial 2021 report, which was in March. By the way, I mentioned this on my other program. If you ever heard me stumble reading stories, part of the reason is because I had my microphone positioned in a way that still kind of blocked my laptop where I'm reading from the computer. So now I went ahead and adjusted the microphone to put it in a different place to make it easier to read. So I'm not stumbling so much to read my screen. So if I do the stumble once in a while, some days are better than others. I'm going to admit that I do that. I'm not perfect, but I wanted to make sure to make that point. So the Infinite Dial survey. Why is podcasting so important? Well, podcast listenership has grown to 116 million people. It was 75 million people probably about 5 years ago. 1 out of every 3 Americans. Basically. And the pandemic certainly accelerated the growth. So who are the people that listen to podcasts anyway? Why are all these people that do all these podcasts, which is I think 8,000 podcasts out there, maybe more. Well, there's probably hundreds of thousands, honestly. But of the ones that stand up top. And why are celebrities coming in? Why are everybody else, any influencers, why is everybody having to have a podcast? Because you can, number one. Number two, it's who you find an audience with. And an audience that will give you the attention span that is not a TikTok, not an Instagram reel, not a Facebook Live, not a YouTube video. When you're listening to a podcast, you are putting down significant time, and it's audio. So when you give an advertisement or you're marketing something, people get to hear that, and they're hearing it from a trusted source, or they're hearing it within long-form content of which somebody is willing to patronize and listen to sponsorships because they're not so frequent. On this program itself, with an hour format, you might hear 3 minutes of advertising the whole show in 60 minutes, spread out over 3 breaks. I think that's being pretty fair. That's pretty fair for what I do. And I try to spread them out as much as I can so you get a good chunk of content before an ad comes right up. Now, 43% of men, 39% of women in the U.S. listen to podcasts. And that 39% of women is very big. It's an all-time high. When you look at ethnicity, it's still predominantly white, 57%. The Hispanic and Asian populations have increased. African American, 13%. Hispanic, 16%. Asian, 4%. Plus, podcast listeners are younger early adopters of technology who can be difficult reaching traditional advertising channels. Half of all podcasts listeners are aged 12 to 34. The other half are listeners 35 and up. When I look at my stats, the ones that I can see from Spotify for my programming, the one on the podcasting series, which I can look at a sample of the audience, that's a good balance of what I have in my audience. When I'm not podcasting, I look at the stats that Spotify provides, and I look at the makeup of the audience. I can see, and I'm pulling it up right now as we speak, there's no real rhythm or rhyme to the audience of where they listen to when it comes to the distribution. It's all over the place. But for what can I see in Spotify, the 35 plus audience is 50% exactly. The other 50% is under 35. So 15% 28 30 34, 18% 23 27, 17% 18 to 22, and I have a small bit 1% under 17. But my audience is an adult-based program. But that 50% right there is in the money demographic, 18 to 34, add the 19%, and I'm hitting 70% of the 18 to 49 demographic, which is important for television just as much as it is for radio. That's the audience you're trying to get in the same way. So the data points to the ability of advertisers to create highly bespoke, yet scalable audio-specific campaigns that engage and onboard listeners to their brands. Targeting and messaging strategies can be based on the readily available information provided by the networks and shows themselves, segmented by show genre and show listener demographics, including age, gender, ethnicity, and designated marketing era. There's more to this. In a 4,000-person survey, a great deal of podcasting listens at home. 90% say they listen to their favorite podcasts in their home, 64% in their cars. We know the pandemic has swayed that change up because there's a lot more remote work. And the focused and personal listening that podcasting provides helps to drive the efficiency associated with advertising and generating leads. Advertisers can also take advantage of these engaged listeners, creating relationships with the hosts, onboarding them to their product or service. The other difference, there are some people that market products and allow sampling by the host to go ahead and endorse and give a proper endorsement. So we've known that for a long time. Edison Research also had a Super Listeners 2020 report that says that they believe podcast hosts that people regularly listen to actually use the products and services mentioned on their podcasts. Because of podcasting, I did become a buyer of Dollar Shave Club. That is ultimately, I've had Dollar Shave Club for the last, I want to say 6 years now, and that's because of podcasting. I listen to it. The Grill Daddy, I have it in my home as a result of podcast advertising. Quite a bit of the Podcast One content, when Podcast One was really pushing out content for different shows, especially the wrestling content, which I listened to quite a bit of. And we also know smart speaker market is also growing year after year. 21% of people who listen to podcasts are through their smart speakers. They do so with one or more people, which is also the other thing that's going to be considered when people are listening, streaming, or downloading, that you also need to go ahead and consider the amount of people streaming your content as opposed to downloads, which is why when I look at stats, I look at streams and downloads and try to calculate from there. So keep that in your methodology as you look at your stats. The same people who listen to podcasts not only spend time with them, they also engage in social media, creating an opportunity for brands to build close relationships with multi-platform distribution. This is why everybody gets on board with podcasting. I just happen to be here for a long time. And with what we do, where I do it at my full time, we use a different format where it's not so much inserting advertising because you only can make so much money doing the advertising model that is with all these shows, because it's based on the measurement of the audience, which you need to have particular metrics. But you have to go ahead and expect such a big audience to make that happen. But when you have programming like what we do that's concentrated to a particular sector of audience, and we reach that audience directly, and then we have somebody that comes on to sponsor their program to reach the audience that we have or the audience they want directly, that's what we do. Podcast advertising offers an exciting opportunity to reach these highly desirable podcast people who are often difficult to reach through more traditional tactics and can drive incrementally over existing media plans. Where else do you have a medium where people will listen to advertising and patronize said ads? This is why podcasting is so important now. eMarketer reports that podcasting will surpass $2 billion by 2023. The level of money coming in is huge. Now, we already know that podcasting in the U.S. is going to cross the $1 billion mark this year, and then double in 2 years. A lot of growth. And this money, this advertising dollar, is being replaced with what was on cable or network TV. They have to go somewhere to advertise. So if podcasting's it, they're going to try to do it. Now, what eMarketer also entails is that there's going to be more money being spent on advertising, but then it will level itself out in the next 4 years. Because I think the growth of advertising dollars will slow down. So that's an interesting thing that they did. And you look at the players that are coming into the space trying to monetize podcasting, radio first and foremost. The slew of acquisitions and major moves from top companies has not helped with fragmentation when it comes to advertising in the podcast space. iHeartMedia, which last year brought in more podcast ad revenues than any other company we track. That's what eMarketer does. They still accounted for only 10% of total U.S. podcast ad spending in 2020, with the rest distributed across various creators, publishers, and platforms. Now, Conal Byrne, president of the iHeartMedia Podcast Network, says, quote, "There are really two industries underneath. There's the audience industry and the subscription industry. The subscription industry, which includes luminary Spotify using podcasts as a lead generator to get you to buy something else that's not a podcast. The audience industry is a very simple business model. Every single thing we make, we will distribute everywhere. But then, the game has changed. And that is Apple making that change. We talked about how Apple now has premium broadcasting right now. You now have paid podcasting, paid programming, if you will, where you have to subscribe and you pay a fee. The Ridgefield Press presents us a story about this. And Ridgefield is in Ridgefield, Connecticut, by the way, a Hearst publication of who I actually worked for at one point. Now, they took the story from a website called theconversation.com. And The Conversation had this story that was written by the professor of media and communication for Muhlenberg College, John Sullivan, who wrote this story. So now I just want to take a couple of things that come from this story and just focus on what he says that I think are important to bring up. So as you know, podcasting really became the mainstream in 2005, which is when I came in. And the bosses that I now work for, they started this back in 2003. So they transformed iTunes into a sophisticated podcaster. The Apple Podcast app was default now on iPhones by late 2014. That's what they've done in their evolution of being the podcast giant. They have the largest podcast directory, serving as a gateway to tens of thousands of new podcasts and an archive of the medium's history, storing the RSS feed of shows no longer releasing new episodes. As you know, producing a podcast can be simple as recording audio on your computer or mobile phone, uploading it to a podcast hosting service, making your show is listed with the major directories like Apple, Spotify, Google Podcast, and Amazon, John. Going to mention that. While there is a general fee charged by hosting companies for storing audio files and managing your feed, then you now have free options like Anchor, purchased by Spotify, uploading and listening podcasts for free, and has helped to make Spotify one of the top podcast outlets there is. In 2020, users launched 1 million new podcasts via Anchor alone. Then Spotify gets exclusive. But now we have paid subscriptions and other forms of monetization were before left to in-show advertising, merchandising, and crowdfunding. Apple didn't even allow podcast creators to access listening data, like audience demographics or how long users listen to an episode, until 2017. Which I know with the advertisers we tried to reach out to, they all asked for metrics. And they wanted what Apple provided. And there was only so much of the API of the metrics that we had from Apple Podcast that would give us some information to go ahead and give to said advertisers. So that's why only the advertisers decided to go with people that they knew or were familiar with that were willing to go ahead and gamble on, basically. But then we started seeing the changes last year. Spotify moving into the space, exclusively securing contracts with top podcasters like Joe Budden and Joe Rogan. We're going to talk about Joe Budden in just a moment. Apple's preeminence as a top destination was threatened. And then Spotify started making exclusive podcast deals with high-profile talent to draw more to their ecosystem and keep them there. So competition has created where we are today with podcasting. Now, it has brought in more listeners, and it's brought in more advertising revenue. So that's great. And it will level off at some point and become a burgeoning industry, which you couldn't have said that 10 years ago. People would have laughed at you. So, Spotify's strategy has paid off. User listenership on their podcast app is expected to surpass Apple in 2021. So now Apple is not just the aggregator. They're now going to get into the content business themselves. So according to Professor Sullivan, at the risk of being sidelined, Apple's status as podcasting's benevolent absentee landlord has changed. So now paid subscriptions will exist on their platform. Now, they did have a point where you could put up paid episodes, like you would just to put paid music. There was that for many years. And I remember buying a couple of episodes that were premium episodes, but you had to be somebody specific to be able to do that. But now you have paid subscriptions because the volatility of having a Patreon or a Subscribe Star or any other crowdfunding platform doesn't work as well as you can if you get an Apple to do that for you. So they have this now. And they want to do more for their creators, because every social media or every major digital media platform now, they're trying to go ahead and service their creators and offer more resources to make more money. So now Apple will allow creators to place their podcasts behind a paywall via the Apple Podcast app. So now the creators can easily monetize their content with the most listeners, though with a hefty surcharge applied. What they're basically doing is starting to monetize off of creators like they did the App Store not too long ago. And this slew of apps that were coming in from the early 2010s all the way to now. And the level of money they make per subscription to do that. Rather than an all or nothing approach, Apple's decided to allow podcasters to decide whether their content is exclusive to Apple or whether it will appear outside of the app. However, as many have discovered, the system is turned off by default. So Apple, taking a cut of the creator's premium content, is now firmly in the content business. And now we can expect more exclusive shows for Apple Podcasts. To me, to try to do this model here and try to replicate what you're doing with streaming media with the Apple Plus, Hulu, Roku, all these other things, I don't know if it works so well. And I don't know if I care about exclusive content. It wasn't that long ago we had exclusive content was done by Quibi to put under a paywall, and that failed miserably. And by the way, when I talked about Quibi falling, I think wasn't it last May? No, it was I forget, it was like last August. I forget what it was. But the content, and I said this back then, that content would still be good for somebody, so hopefully somebody bought it. Well, Roku did on the dollar, pennies on the dollar basically, and now they're going to push it out for free to get more people to go into their original content, because now Roku's in the original content business as well. So the digital providers are now trying to also be content providers, because they just can't provide the platform. They now need to provide the content to also further the platform. But as long as the other creators are able to exist among those shows, so like shows like mine can still be on Apple Podcasts aligned alongside these paid programs, I'm fine with that. I don't expect my programs to go ahead and take over anything. But what they will do is they will at least go ahead and move along and say, hey, you know what? At least I have these programs and I can put them where everybody else finds them. That's what's most important to me. That's what matters to me anyway as a creator. Not much more. But there are those that definitely want to go be able to monetize. And I'm not so much into the business of wanting to hear somebody do content and know they're doing a freemium model, and you can tell it is, and they're doing the paywall. And, some of the ways they do it, I don't like. When you can't provide, I can't do that where I feel like I have certain content I can just label premium. I don't feel like I have anything like that. For me, I'd rather keep myself ad supported. I couldn't do a subscription model. I don't know if I want to, no matter how big I got. I don't know if that's for me or not. Now, in the story, they go on to continue and write, a medium that exploded due to the lack of institutional gatekeepers is now seeing big tech act like traditional media networks, signing popular hosts and shows to exclusive contracts. Other publishers like Slate and Stitcher have offered subscriptions to their shows via websites and mobile apps. But the larger audience share of Apple Podcasts and Spotify has much greater potential to move the podcast ecosystem in the direction of premium paid content. So the evolution could be very well that direction. But the one thing I have to say, too, is that there's got to be something to be said about the volatility of all these celebrity podcasts and all these high-profile shows, the level of frequency they give out, the level of content they deliver, and the volatility in the fact that those shows could go away anytime. Because for myself, I do shows that have continued to go along. I never miss a week. Rarely do I miss a week. Of this program, I don't think I've missed a week. No, I think I did once or twice. But then, when I'm talking about my wrestling show, no, I don't miss a week. I've had people fill in a couple of times. So there's that to consider as well. So another story I want to talk about is the Hollywood end, because that focus in our deep dive of podcasting tonight has to be considered. We know about it, but there are more things that are going on right now, importantly. And I have a lot of stuff I was going to talk about when it comes to Disney Plus, and I will gloss over it in a few minutes just to make the point. But I got to go and talk about more about this. So Hollywood giving the nod to companion podcast. So now we know about Joe Rogan Experience. We know about Stitcher being purchased by SiriusXM, $325 million. A lot of money being spent on content, on platforms. We know that. And now there are programming that's out there that's a companion podcast to some of the programming that's done by, say, like HBO. Their Chernobyl companion podcast, paving the way for Allen versus Farrow. Woody Allen versus Mia Farrow. The new series is coming out now. And having a podcast would allow it to delve into the history-based narrative. The HBO filmmakers right now are doing companion podcasts, but are not being compensated, with the work falling under their marketing commitments. Netflix has also gotten into space. They have The Crown, the official podcast, and its behind-the-scenes series tackling everything from Stranger Things to The Witcher. This is another area that doesn't get talked a lot about, but people will listen to it because they are fans. And the stand-up out there could be something big. Now, one of the things that's going on right now that's very interesting is we heard about the issues when it comes... Now, Dak Shepard, we hear about him. We know who he is. He's now hosting his own podcast. Got some exclusive deal, and I think it's on Spotify. And then we just heard today the volatility of podcasts from the largest end. There was a real-time implosion of the Joe Budden podcast, which is exclusively on Spotify, which got brought over to Spotify. So the host of the popular twice-weekly show fired his longtime co-hosts, Rory Farrell and Jamil Mal-McClay, in the wake of pay and an accounting dispute. The Joe Budden podcast has been on since 2016. And Joe Budden's expertise in hip-hop and R&B is really what's part of the conversation, which could sound deep in the weeds nerd talk to the layperson, but steers into interesting, unexpected directions when he's bouncing off of his boys. So a very concentrated portion of content. Great. But having this kind of thing happen, that's not good. There's a volatility that goes on with some of these shows. We know the same thing happened with Call Me Daddy, the Barstool Sports podcast. That was actually one of the number one podcasts in the country not too long ago, because there was an issue where those two hosts decided to drop out to do the show. The volatility of that is not helpful either, but that's because there's so much money in it. And I don't want to hear about the inner workings of these shows that are not in it for the content. And all this back and forth internal rumblings doesn't help. And it hurts the top end of the podcasting area because of the advertisers having an issue where the Joe Budden podcast now is now compromised. Will the advertisers stay on as a result? And there is so much more going on as well. I can talk about how SiriusXM is also delving really big into podcasting as well. And then we, of course, have to talk about NPR. And basically, Washington Post referring to the fact that NPR, when you listen to their radio programs, they sound like podcasts. So a story they put up is why your favorite NPR show might sound like a lot like a podcast. Because it might have come from that, and just the way the format works is something that people feel like it's working well. So originally they had a show called Throughline in 2019 to help Americans remember the issues when it comes to cultural divide. And the show then moved over to radio. So normally it's not the other way. It is going from podcasting to terrestrial radio, which we talked about a while back, how iHeartRadio decided to put their podcasting model out onto one radio network and just run podcasts all day, 24 hours as a talk network. I think it was a ridiculous idea. I don't even know if that's actually still on or what, but I haven't followed up on it. Now, NPR, which according to the Washington Post, is celebrating its 50th year of its first original radio broadcast, continues to struggle to bolster a listenership that is rapidly aging, which is why they're now trying to use podcasts, which already has a younger audience, and trying to draw people over to listen to them on radio. Now, of course, we know they branched out into digital media, where younger, more diverse listeners already are, particularly podcasts. And mostly, you have to keep in mind that NPR, I always felt like, well, they don't need the radio format because they're doing so well in podcasting. Like, they're making all their money there. They're making their audience right there. Like, it would probably be better off if NPR continued to be funded just to do podcasts and not even use the radio. Leave the radio airwaves to other people. Put those radio stations up for sale and allow them to be occupied by local broadcasters. So we got some real compelling content, not national content like everybody else. So their audience, it mirrors the racial demographics than it does this traditional radio audience. This is according to ratings from Nielsen for NPR, shared with the Washington Post. People of color make up 43% of NPR's podcast listenership. The radio audience, 21%. And the NPR radio audience is older than 44 years old. Their podcast listenership are between the ages of 18 and 44. Plus, podcasts generate NPR's largest chunk of corporate sponsorship money. The amount of NPR's podcasts have made in the last 5 years have tripled. It's huge. But they say that radio still remains paramount for NPR, relying more heavily on the fees it receives from affiliate stations nationwide. The member stations get money through various means, pledge drives, sponsors, and the federally funded Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I still think they could go and unload those radio stations and just focus on podcasting itself. And you could really just stream NPR as a programming model, as a streaming live model, and put it on all different platforms. They should do that. And I always thought it was important that Apple continue to keep the radio format up. They still have streaming up there, but it's just not anything they promote at all. At one point they kind of did, but not so much. So I want to go ahead and focus a little bit on Disney Plus's Plunge. I think just a couple of quick stories to really stand out. That tells you everything that's going wrong with their issues right now. Because it's a testament to corporate affecting creative. And these corporate media giants not able to go ahead and keep up with the change caused by the digital disruption, which is why you need to keep this in mind when you are following along. So now Bob Iger, who has been a long time part with Capital Cities, ABC, during some very good heady years, you now have a new CEO, Bob Chapek, asserting more authority, and the relationship that they actually had has strained because now new leadership is coming in and making some major changes. And how's it worked out? Well, we're going to find out. One Disney executive that spoke to Variety magazine under anonymity says that, quote, things are radically different than they were 6 months ago. And the senior leaders have tried to insulate the creative teams from all the upheaval. Now, the CEO came in February 2020 as attention was focused largely on keeping Disney afloat on the height of the pandemic. And when the theme parks went down, that revenue going away, obviously a panic was set in. And they started making some drastic changes. Disney's moved last October to restructure its operations, elevated the executives who distribute Disney movies and shows over the ones who actually oversee their production. And the shakeup granted a great deal of influence to a top Chapek ally, Kareem Daniel, elevated the chairman of Disney Media and Entertainment Distribution from his previous role of overseeing consumer products. So now you have a lot of changes to people that might not necessarily fill the right void. Hollywood dealmakers noted the new structure of Disney is Byzantine and more convoluted than necessary, with an extra managerial layer into the process of getting projects made, which is big. So collusion now and a wall or a moat basically around the castle of Disney to try to get projects greenlit or try to get projects done, and trying to get the green lights or the easy pipeline to get things done efficiently. That's big. Well, as a result, what you can go into the story and you can talk all the issues they had of what they've been doing. Let's go ahead and talk about it. Because Disney, as they disappointed their shareholders this week. Variety.com reports that their quarterly earnings slowed. And that was partly because they were hoping that hits like WandaVision and The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, they got a lot of critical fanfare. Like, I can't tell you how many times I saw people on Twitter or anywhere else, or all the stories that were talked about it over the last 6 months. Well, it didn't bring subscribers to Disney Plus. The quarterly report was mixed. Their conglomerate stock fell sharply, more than 4% in after-hours trading. Their revenue fell short of expectations, and they only reported 103 million subscribers to streaming, which is still an improvement, but they were expecting higher expectations. They really were trying to play that they were going to get a big audience from all these new shows, especially the Marvel shows. They thought it was going to really make a big difference, and a new Mandalorian season as well. So they really put everything into this. Now, they had the delay release of blockbuster movies, which did not help. Streaming services did get up and have expanded their reach at a time where consumers are stuck at home. You still have the parks operating at limited capacity, which is not helping. So, with all the things that are going on with Disney, they really needed the digital end to carry everything else. So all that money into the content they put together to get it out there, and it didn't get the subscribers because the Disney Plus model is supposed to really pick up everything else. They were hoping it was going to go and overtake what they were missing in the parks when it comes to the attendance, the merchandise, all the other things that go along with it. But the parks are going to reopen, so that's going to help. They'll have more blockbuster movies set to come out. Jungle Cruise, Black Widow, and Cruella. And they will continue to use Disney Plus as a model to go ahead and use a 45-day theatrical window before they go ahead and push it out to Disney Plus. But it hurt. So they were trying to make big changes. The corporate shakeup is now in play, and they're off to a shaky start, going from one CEO to the other. So Disney Plus, so far, has not completely panned out as it could have been so far. A lot of different interesting stories right here. So we leave it there, and I'm going to go ahead and come back in next week. We'll talk about something else, whatever comes up in the next week in the world of media. And if there's anything you want to talk about here on the show, if you think you would like to be a worthy guest in the program here on the Broadcasters Podcast, please email me, kingofpodcasts@yahoo.com. kingofpodcasts@yahoo.com, or go to kingofpodcasts.com. You can go ahead and find a contact form where you can reach out to me there. And also remember, find the show, bookmark the website, broadcasterspodcast.com. All of my past episodes are there, all 173 of them, including this one. Until next week, remember, content is king, and the control of your content is in your hands.
Thank you for listening to the Broadcasters Podcast. Find all the links to subscribe to the show by going to broadcasterspodcast.com. And don't forget to check out the King of Podcasts wrestling program, the Wrestling is Real podcast, exclusively at wrestlingisreal.com.